Now, before we move on, you might wonder, is it possible to do this pivot table without using the with? And it is, but this is what you can't do. You can't simply go like this, and there we go, select year, month, amount, and pivot it. Because if you remember, when we look at the start, the results come back in of the year, column 1, column 2, column 3. The results don't come back with the month and amount. So as soon as we try and do select month and amount from table transaction, it just says, I don't know what you're talking about, because the columns I want to give you include columns 1, 2, 3, and so forth. So what you have to do instead is say select star from and use this select statement as a derived table in the from. And what do you do with a derived table? You have to alias it. So you're really not gaining anything by not using the with, but it is possible. I prefer the with because of clarity. It just keeps the pivot table simple. Now we have these nulls at the bottom. What can we do about them? Well, the reason the nulls exist is because there are no rows with 2016 month 2, 2016 month 3. And unless you actually want to create these rows, like for instance say union 2016 to 0, and select 2016 to 0, which would at least give you a 0 to put in. Unless you want to do that with all of them, then you're going to have to find another way of doing it. And it seems that the best way is to actually write out the entire list, so of columns, the year and numbers 1 to 12. And then what we do is use is null. Now if you remember, is null returns the first non-null value. So if the answer to 1 is null, then we need to return a 0. Like that. But unfortunately doing that means we lose the column name, so we then have to alias the column. So as 1, say, in this case. And then do the same for 2, and 3, and 4, and it can get very repetitious. But unfortunately, if I just do it for number 2, and put 2 in the is null, there we are, we now have a 0 instead of null. Unfortunately, this is the commonly accepted solution. I wish it weren't, but it is one where you can get rid of the nulls, but you have to do for each individual column. Great. So here we have the full statement. So I've replaced is null another 10 times. If I run it, there we have the zeros. So pivot, open bracket, aggregate, for name of spreading column, in and in brackets, the names of the columns. 2 close brackets, as name of pivot table. That's the syntax to remember. Now I do have 2 tips for pivot tables. The first one is that in your source data, you reduce the amount of columns to the minimum that you need. So the minimum that we need here are the year, the spreading column, and the values. If I was to add in, for instance, the data transaction, just look at the mayhem that would do. Even though it's not in the select statement, you can see the effect. We now have 709 rows. And the reason for that is if I put data transaction into the select statement, you can see we have 1 row per select for data of transaction. Just create complete mayhem with what we wanted. And then what we'd have to do is to sum all of this lot instead of a simple solution. We'd then have to do sum of is null, and then we'd have to group by and all the rest of it. So make sure that the columns in the source data are reduced to the bare minimum. My second tip is to make sure the number of rows in the source data is reduced to a bare minimum. Here we only need 25 rows. 12 here, 12 for 2015 and 1 for 2016. Instead, however, if I run this table, you can see we have 2,486 rows. You can see rows 1 and 3 have the same year and the same month, and they would be in the same cell here in the pivot. So I would suggest you summarize the data before it goes into the pivot. So if I put sum of the amount as amount from the table transaction, that will now reduce the number of rows in the source data. If I also remember to group by, like that, to the bare minimum. We have 25 values after the pivot, and before the pivot we have 25 rows. It's that sort of matching which makes debugging pivots so much easier. You saw the mayhem that just one extra column introduces. Reduce the amount of columns you got, reduce the amount of rows, save yourself a lot of trouble.